Hello and welcome to a journey into a world that should not have risen, and by every measure should not have endured. Imagine a civilization carved into stone and jungle, a people who built astronomy into their temples, mathematics into their cities, and time itself into their calendars, all without metal wheels, beasts of burden, or rivers gentle enough to ease their labor. By every logical expectation, a society born in such a harsh landscape should never have blossomed, and yet, for nearly 2,000 years they created a world that could rival the greatest empires of antiquity. This is the story of the Maya and the long, trembling descent into their mysterious collapse. What forces conspired to unravel their order? What unseen pressures bent their kingdoms to breaking? What choices made by kings and commoners alike set the stage for a downfall still debated today? In this story, we will follow the rise of sacred kings and the cities they commanded, the growing weight of warfare and ambition, the shifting climate that tightened around them like a closing hand, the human struggle beneath the grandeur, and the echoes left behind when the last fires dimmed. Before we begin, settle yourself. Let the modern world fall away. Let the glow of your room fade into the imagined warmth of torchlight dancing across carved limestone. Close your eyes and allow the centuries to loosen. The jungle breathes and the night hums. We are going far back into a world where stone cities rose like mountains and where silence would one day reclaim them. The kingdoms in the green sea. The story of the Maya begins not with open plains or generous rivers, but with forests so dense they swallowed sound. In these green depths, the first villages clung to the edges of clearings, their people wholly dependent on thin soils and unpredictable rains. The stakes from the start were severe. A harvest failed, and hunger spread quickly. A dry season extended, and entire communities trembled. Yet in this unforgiving place, human ambition rose like smoke. The earliest Maya transformed scattered hamlets into centers of ritual and authority, each guided by leaders who claimed power not through metal or armies, but through knowledge of the stars of seasons of the divine order they said governed all things. These early rulers introduced a revolutionary concept, the sacred king, a figure who merged political leadership with cosmic responsibility. It was an innovation that bound society together. If the king read the heavens correctly, crops might flourish. If he honored the gods properly, rain might return. But this was only the beginning. Stone that remembered time. The growth of Maya cities demanded more than leadership. It required new ways to control time itself. As populations expanded, the Maya turned to an extraordinary innovation, a calendrical system of breathtaking precision. This was not mere record-keeping. It was architecture for memory, a way to anchor human life to celestial rhythms. Stelae rose in plazas like standing histories, each one declaring victories, births, alliances, and omens. They were carved not just to inform, but to legitimize stone propaganda that connected rulers to an eternal cosmic cycle. But behind this cultural brilliance lay fragility. The forests around each city shrank as stoneworking, plaster production, and agriculture consumed trees by the thousands. Fields had to be stretched, terraced, drained, reclaimed from swamp and hillside alike. The very system that gave the Maya their power required constant extraction. And this too was only the beginning, the lords of rain and war. As cities matured, ambition surged. Where one sacred king had once governed a humble center, now dozens ruled over sprawling kingdoms whose borders increasingly pressed against each other. The stakes intensified. Prestige demanded monuments, monuments demanded labor, labor demanded food, and food demanded ever more land. Warfare, once ritualized and limited, began to evolve into something more expansive. Captives became currency, political, religious, and symbolic. Victories fueled the authority of kings, defeats invited rebellion. A new political idea emerged, the super kingdom, a state that expanded its influence across multiple cities through alliances, intimidation, or conquest. This innovation reshaped Maya politics, creating power blocks that strained the balance of the southern lowlands. And under the canopy, Ordinary people felt the weight of these rivalries, heavier tribute, longer labor rotations, and an ever-present sense that the world around them was tightening. Yet even now the unraveling had not truly begun. The forces that would test the Maya had only started to gather beyond the horizon. The thirst beneath the canopy. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, the kind of change that slips into a world so slowly that no one, not even the wisest skywatchers, marked its first arrival. Rains that had once followed reliable cycles started to falter. At first it was only a few weeks' delay, a subtle thinning of cloud cover, a dryness that clung to the edges of the season. Farmers noticed it before the kings did. Maize leaves curled too soon, cenotes receded. Reservoirs carved over generations drew down a little lower than memory allowed. What began as whisper became pattern, and what became pattern soon became pressure. Faced with uncertain skies, communities pushed deeper into the forest to expand their fields. The old equilibrium, the careful balance between cleared land and regrowth, began to tilt. Ash-fertilized soils lost their richness sooner. Yields grew unpredictable. In a world where divine order was linked to the king's ability to summon rain, every dry season became a test of legitimacy. And the tests were becoming more frequent. But this tension born of sky and soil was only the next layer of what was soon to unfold, the fragile miracle of water. Water had always been the contradiction at the heart of Maya civilization. The lowlands, wrapped in humidity and thunder, seemed abundant. Yet beneath that illusion, a stark reality persisted. There were almost no rivers large enough to sustain major cities. Every palace, every temple, every marketplace owed its existence to human ingenuity alone. Communities carved vast reservoirs into limestone bedrock, lined them with clay, and shaped their cityscapes around the capture of seasonal rains. They engineered channels and berms and catchment systems so intricate that entire cities became hydrological organisms. But this brilliance came with a weakness. These reservoirs were only as strong as the skies that fed them. As rain cycles became erratic, water management shifted from a background system to a constant concern. Priests recalculated rituals. Architects reevaluated canals. Laborers worked longer hours to deepen cisterns. In the grand plazas, rulers stood before crowds and performed ceremonies meant to reassure, gestures meant to say, "We still command the balance." Yet cracks once invisible were forming, and water which had sustained greatness began to expose the limits of an empire built on uncertain rains. Still, the true unraveling had yet to come. Cities entangled in ambition. Even as environmental pressures grew, political horizons widened. Kings who sensed weakness in their rivals moved aggressively to expand influence. Victories, once symbolic affairs meant to display cosmic favor, grew more strategic, designed to seize territory, interrupt trade, or destabilize alliances. Rival capitals watched each other with sharpened eyes. Calakmul extended its reach across the basin, drawing distant lords into its orbit. Tikal, long a giant in the central lowlands, sought to reclaim power lost to earlier defeats. Scores of secondary cities aligned themselves along these shifting gravitational pulls, creating a political landscape increasingly defined by tension. This environment demanded constant displays of strength. New monuments were commissioned, each larger than the last. Ceremonies grew more elaborate. Trade routes, already strained by environmental decline, had to be protected with greater vigilance. Common people felt the strain first. Tribute requirements rose. More hands were needed for construction. More warriors were needed for campaigns. A society that had stretched itself across hundreds of kilometers of forest was beginning to feel the weight of its own expansion. Yet ambition, once awakened, was difficult to contain, and even now the core crisis still waited ahead: the roads that became burdens. The Maya world was connected by a web of stone roads, Sakbiob, gleaming white under the sun. These were not mere pathways, they were declarations of order, carved straight through the confusion of the forest-binding cities into networks of trade and tribute. For centuries, these roads strengthened unity. But in times of strain, they also magnified instability. A drought in one city radiated outward along these routes, spreading scarcity. A rebellion in a small kingdom could sever connections between greater ones. When armies marched, they marched along Sakbiob, turning channels of commerce into channels of war. Maintaining these lines required labor on a scale few societies could match. Roadbeds had to be leveled, resurfaced, and continually cleared. Travelers, officials, traders all depended on a system that demanded unending attention. As the climate pressed harder and political tensions sharpened, these roads began to feel less like veins of prosperity and more like arteries stretched too thin. Still the empire continued to move, still the forest kingdoms strained to keep balance, but the sense of gathering pressure, a quiet tightening, grew with every passing season. The temples that echoed emptiness. Through it all, the temple stood. Magnificent sky, reaching heavy with carved prophecy and history. Yet inside their sanctuaries, where priests maintained sacred fires and read the heavens, a new kind of silence began to grow. It was not the silence of abandonment, not yet. It was the silence of doubt. Astronomers tracked celestial cycles as they always had, but the patterns no longer aligned cleanly with earthly circumstances. Offerings increased, but rains remained fickle. Kings performed rituals, but defeats still came. Something deeper than politics was shifting the belief that the cosmic order could be read, interpreted, and influenced by human action. For a civilization that lived by cycles, the breaking of a cycle even subtly held profound implications. The temples, still radiant in the sun, had begun to echo with a quiet uncertainty. And beneath that uncertainty, the first tremors of collapse were building. But the breaking point had not arrived. The day the omens faltered. The first unmistakable sign that something profound had shifted came not from the sky nor the soil, but from a ceremony meant to reaffirm stability. A ruler stood before his people, incense burning in spirals around him, jade glinting at his wrists. Priests chanted the cycles, stepping through motions practiced for generations. The crowd watched, waiting for the expected conclusion, the moment when divine alignment and royal authority fused into renewed certainty. But when the sacred flames sputtered instead of roaring upward, when the wind failed to carry incense as it always had, murmurs rippled through the plaza. Such events had explanations in the old texts, usually benign. Yet, in a world already strained by droughts and warfare, this faltering omen felt heavier. People whispered that the gods might be unsettled, and once whispered, such thoughts did not easily fade. The ceremony continued, the ruler's expression unchanged. But beneath the calm surface, a fracture had formed, a subtle break in the confidence that the world could still be read through ritual. It was small, barely visible, but it was only the beginning. When the people began to drift out in celestial order, did not stay confined to temples. It seeped outward, carried through marketplaces, whispered beneath woven roofs, shared quietly during long walks to distant fields. For the first time in generations, people began to question whether their labor, their bricks hauled, their stones carved, their harvests surrendered, still served a cosmic purpose. And when belief weakens, loyalty follows. Some families began to drift away from crowded capitals, slipping into the forest margins to reclaim ancestral lands. Others migrated to smaller towns where tribute demands were lighter and fields less exhausted. Still others traveled north or west, following rumors of places where rainfall was kinder. These movements, at first scattered and faint, represented an unforeseen challenge. Cities had grown through concentration of labor, of tribute, of ritual importance. A kingdom could be mighty only so long as people remained in its orbit. But now the gravitational pull was weakening. The countryside, once shaped to serve urban centers, began to reclaim its independence. And the same migration that had once built cities was slowly beginning to unbuild them. Still, the deeper cracks had yet to split open. The wars that became too many conflict. long woven into Maya political life, began to intensify beyond precedent. Ambitions sharpened by scarcity drove cities to seek advantage wherever they could find it. Battles once fought to display cosmic alignment evolved into campaigns to seize control over water sources, trade paths, and agricultural lands. Armies marched more frequently, fortifications multiplied. Walls that once served as ceremonial boundaries were reinforced into genuine defenses. For common people, this brought fear and exhaustion. Fields left untended during campaigns suffered losses that deepened hunger. Young men taken for war thinned the labor force. Families fleeing the path of armies abandoned homes that would never again be rebuilt. And as conflict escalated, alliances grew volatile. A city might rise through conquest only to face rebellion months later. Power became fluid, unstable, shifting like water over rough stone. The kings who once projected divine assurance now faced enemies on all sides, rival lords, restless subjects, failing skies. Yet even as war eroded stability, something more profound was unfolding inside the cities themselves: the burden of the monuments. The grand plazas of the Maya world had always been symbols of endurance, proof that stone could hold memory against the jungle's encroaching force. But in times of stress, these very monuments became burdens. Construction did not stop when drought arrived, nor when wars multiplied, nor when people drifted away. Kings, needing to prove their favor with the gods, ordered new pyramids, new stelae, new temple expansions. To stop building was to admit weakness. To show weakness was to invite challenge. Thus, even as the population thinned, labor demands rose. Even as fields struggled, limestone quarries rang with the sound of chisels. Even as families fled, rulers demanded more tribute. Monuments became statements of desperation rather than confidence, towering efforts to hold back unraveling forces with stone and ceremony. Yet stone, for all its permanence, could not anchor a society that was slowly losing the ability to sustain itself. And still the breaking point had not arrived. The kings, who could no longer promise tomorrow. In the palaces, rulers faced a crisis they could not publicly acknowledge. The ancient language of power was losing its potency. A king's legitimacy depended on his ability to mediate between the human world and the divine. But with reigns, erratic wars unending, and people drifting away, the connection between ruler and cosmos appeared strained. Priests expanded rituals, lengthened ceremonies, introduced new interpretations of omens. They sought explanations in eclipses, alignments, and distant prophecies. But each explanation felt thinner than the last, more effortful, less convincing. In council chambers, nobles quietly questioned decisions once beyond doubt. In households across the city, people wondered whether their sacrifices still mattered. And in the hearts of the rulers themselves, though they would never voice it, a question took shape. What happens when a king cannot keep the world in balance? In a society where divine harmony justified authority, losing that harmony threatened everything. Even the proudest capitals began to sense instability beneath their foundations, as if the stones themselves remembered that they rested upon earth that could shift. And the real collapse, the one that would echo for centuries, was beginning to stir. When the forest began to return, while cities struggled, the forest, ancient, patient, relentless, began its slow return. Fields left fallow for a season sprouted underbrush. Roads untrodden for months filled with vines. Terraces maintained by generations of labor weakened at the edges, the soil sliding back into gullies. Nature was not hostile, it was simply persistent. And as the balance of humans and jungle began to tilt, the land reclaimed spaces that had taken centuries to shape. In distant hamlets, people noticed more animals wandering near old farmlands. Bird calls grew louder around abandoned house mounds. Once clear horizons thickened with green shadows. Change was unfolding everywhere, subtle at first, but gathering momentum. Yet even these shifts did not mark the final stage. They were only signs of something larger building beneath the surface. The tipping point was near, but it had not yet arrived. When the centers began to empty. The first true sign of irreversible change came not from the kings or the priests, but from the plazas themselves, once crowded, vibrant, echoing with footsteps and commerce. People began to vanish from the heart of the cities, not in a sudden wave, but in a slow, thinning like water, leaking unseen from a cracked vessel. Markets that had once been dense with vendors and travellers grew patchy. Stalls stood unattended, paths trodden hard by generations, softened under wind-carried dust. Families who had maintained ancestral homes for centuries quietly packed their goods and left at dusk, taking roads that led away from their rulers rather than toward them. Some sought safer lands beyond the reach of conflict. Some fled taxation and tribute. Some simply followed relatives who believed a better life could be carved out of the frontier. And in these absences, the cities felt their own weight shift, a hollowing sensed before it could be measured. Yet the councils insisted that all was well. The priests declared that cycles fluctuated as they always had. Stone monuments continued to rise, their shadows stretching over streets that no longer resonated with the same human pulse. Still, the unraveling moved quietly forward, gathering momentum with each passing season. The kingdoms that fractured from within power, once concentrated in royal courts, began to scatter. Nobles who had long supported the throne saw the diminishing population as opportunity. Fewer people meant fewer witnesses, fewer rivals, fewer constraints. Ambition, once directed outward toward rival cities, turned inward. Local lords began asserting autonomy. Lineages once united by shared faith in the king now split across competing visions. Councils that had long served ceremonial roles assumed practical power as the king's aura faded. This internal fracturing weakened states from the center. Laws became inconsistent. Collective decisions dissolved into disputes. Road maintenance faltered. Diplomatic ties frayed. In some cities, factions broke into open confrontation, palace guards clashing with noble militias under flickering torches. In others, the decay remained quiet, but no less corrosive alliances dissolving silently, authority slipping away like sand through an open hand. The fragmentation was not just political, it was cultural, spiritual, and emotional, a deep questioning of the structures that had ordered life for centuries. And as unity faded, each city became more vulnerable than the last. But the greatest pressures still waited ahead, the harvests that could no longer feed the stones. Agriculture had always been the pulse of Maya life, the steady rhythm beneath the grandeur of pyramids and palaces. But by now the rhythm faltered. Terraced hillsides eroded faster than they could be rebuilt. Lowland fields, exhausted by continuous planting, bore stunted maize and withering beans. Soil once carefully managed lost its strength as forests were cleared faster than they could return. Families who once produced enough for tribute and trade now struggled to feed themselves. What surplus had existed evaporated. Food shortages spread quietly at first, then forcefully. Across the lowlands, people adapted in small ways, planting in hidden corners of the forest, gathering wild fruits once considered unworthy bartering within shrinking communities. But adaptation could not restore what was lost. The monumental cities, hungry giants of stone, depended on constant agricultural output. Without it, their foundations weakened. Without it, construction slowed, rituals faltered, authority waned. Scarcity hardened every decision. Scarcity eroded trust. Scarcity became a shadow cast over every hearth. Yet the full weight of collapse had not yet pressed down. It was still rising, gathering, waiting for the moment to fall. When kings could not command belief. The divine kingship, the central pillar of Maya civilization, had begun to tremble. A ruler's authority rested on his ability to sustain cosmic order, to summon rains, to guide seasons, to speak with the heavens. But when drought persisted despite rituals, when war continued, despite omens, when hunger deepened, despite sacrifices, people began to ask questions they had once considered unthinkable. In palace courts, servants whispered about prophecies that spoke of cycles ending. In temples, priests argued softly over interpretations they could no longer agree on. And in the streets, families wondered whether their king still understood the world's changing patterns. Even nobles felt unease, not openly, but in the way their support grew conditional, cautious. The The ruler adorned in jade and feathers continued to appear at ceremonies, yet the crowds watched with a different gaze, one threaded with doubt, with distance, with a quiet searching for reassurance that no longer came easily. The king, though still enthroned, had become a symbol, burdened by expectations he could no longer fulfill. And beneath his feet, the stones of his ancestors sensed the shift, the echoes of abandonment. As pressures mounted, entire quarters of once mighty cities fell silent. Houses that had been lived in for generations now sat empty. Workshops that had crafted pottery, textiles, incense burners, all stood deserted. Children no longer played in certain plazas. No fires burned in homes once known for their evening glow. The jungle pressed inward, sensing the vacuum. In the silence of these abandoned districts, a strange sensation settled, a quiet that felt heavy, as if the stones themselves were absorbing the memories of those who had left. Rulers ordered these quarters repopulated, nobles encouraged migration from nearby villages. But people resisted. There was a growing understanding that safety, stability, and opportunity no longer lay in the shadow of towering temples. Some families settled along riverbanks, building new homes from timber rather than stone. Others joined emerging hilltop communities that relied less on large-scale agriculture. Many moved toward the coasts, sensing shifting centers of power. The cities, once magnets drawing people inward, now repelled them outward. And in the widening emptiness, the collapse took on a force of inevitability, the storms of a changing world. The environment continued its long, relentless transformation. Rainfall, once uncertain, now grew starkly irregular, long dry seasons, punctuated by brief, violent storms. Rivers flooded unpredictably. Lakes shrank. Winds carried dust across fields where maize once stood tall. Even where rainfall improved, the soils had lost much of their former resilience. This was not a single drought nor a single shift in climate. It was a sequence, cumulative, compounding each year, building upon the weaknesses laid down by the last. The Maya had endured harsh seasons before. They had adapted for centuries to landscapes that demanded ingenuity and resilience. But this was different. This was a convergence of pressures, political fragmentation, population decline, overexploited land-shifting, climate-crumbling institutions. Any one of these challenges could have been survived. Together they formed a weight under which even a great civilization began to bend. And still the final breaking point lay ahead, waiting like a storm on the horizon. The threshold of no return. The weakening of the great Maya cities had unfolded slowly, like a long-held breath slipping away. But every collapse has a moment, a line crossed invisibly, when decline ceases to be reversible. When the structures of a world no longer merely strain but begin to fold. That moment arrived quietly. It was not marked by a great battle, nor by a single catastrophic drought, nor by any omen carved into stone. It came in the mundane rhythm of life markets failing to gather fields, yielding too little, families leaving in the night. At first, rulers insisted these absences were temporary, that the season would change, that people would return, that the city's pulse would steady. But pulses do not return once the body that sustained them weakens beyond restoration. One evening, in a central plaza where once thousands had gathered, only a few fires burned. Their smoke spiraled into the dark, rising through silence rather than song. The breath of the city, once vibrant, loud, insistent, had become thin. And thin breaths do not last forever. This was the threshold, a quiet shift. A final step into a long night, the walls that could not protect. As population waned and political authority fragmented, cities turned inward for safety. Walls were repaired, gates reinforced, lookouts posted along parapets that had once served more ceremonial than defensive functions. But walls had never been the backbone of Maya cities. Their strength came from cohesion, trade belief, not stone fortification. When unity evaporated, walls held little meaning. In some regions, raiders sensed weakness and tested defenses. Villages fell first, then small towns. These incursions were not vast invasions, but pressures applied steadily, unpredictably. A city might repel one assault only to falter under the weight of another weeks later. A noble's private militia might defend a district that the king's retinue could no longer protect. Some urban centers simply lacked the manpower to guard their full perimeter. Entire sections of wall were left unattended, vulnerable to whoever dared to approach. A breach did not require a massive army, only a band of warriors and a city too depleted to respond. And once walls were broken, the illusion of permanence vanished. The people who remained understood that defenses, once symbolic, were now porous. They understood that the forest, the climate, and rival lords were not the only dangers. The collapse was no longer slow. It had begun to accelerate. The day the courts fell silent. In palace complexes across the lowlands, administrative life had once been ceaseless scribes reciting genealogies, envoys arriving with tribute craftsmen, shaping ceremonial tools, attendants preparing rituals. But as cities emptied, fewer voices echoed in these chambers. The courts, always symbols of sophistication and central order, became hollow. A ruler might still sit upon the throne, but the bustle that affirmed his authority dissipated. Scribes had no messages to record. Tribute lines grew shorter and irregular. Ritual specialists found themselves performing ceremonies before ever-diminishing audiences. In some cities, the king's court relocated to a smaller wing of the palace simply because the main halls felt too vast, too echoing, too eerily quiet. And when the administrative pulse faded, the city's coherence faded with it. Without records, coordination faltered. Without envoys, alliances dissolved. Without tribute, construction ceased. Without ceremony, meaning itself began to slip. The palace had always been the symbolic heart, but by now it resembled a grand vessel with no crew left to steer it, and the tide outside was rising. The gods who waited in silence. For generations, the Maya had turned to their temples for guidance, structures towering over everyday life, repositories of cosmic wisdom carved into stone. Now those temples stood unchanged, but the people seeking answers had grown fewer. Priests still tended fires, still burned incense, still climbed high steps to speak with the heavens, but each ritual carried a heavier burden. Each unanswered plea weighed more sharply on the community. When rains failed, rituals intensified. When war spread, ceremonies lengthened. When famine threatened, offerings increased. Yet the world continued to shift in ways the old calendars had not foreseen. Priests debated quietly behind sanctuary curtains. Some interpreted the signs as the end of a cycle. Some blamed kings' failings. Some argued for new practices, new readings of the stars. But the uncertainty itself marked transformation. In a society where cosmic order had been the axis around which politics and daily life turned, a faltering divine connection struck at the very center of identity. Temples remained standing, but they began to echo, not with prophetic clarity, but with unanswered questions. Still, the final unraveling had not yet arrived. The cities that fell in a single generation. And then the pace quickened. Some capitals that had stood for centuries collapsed within a few decades, a span so brief that elders could remember their childhood city in full glory, even as its final abandonment unfolded before their eyes. Population decline reached a point where critical roles could no longer be sustained. Builders to maintain roads, farmers to feed the elite artisans to craft essential objects, priests to perform rituals, warriors to defend the perimeter. Entire institutions failed because the people who upheld them were gone. In certain regions, famine struck with unexpected severity. In others, war devastated towns faster than they could recover. In still others, the forest reclaimed land so aggressively that houses became engulfed upon abandonment. A once wide world of independent kingdoms began to flicker out one by one, not with explosive destruction, but with the quiet cessation of civic life, a candle extinguished by an unseen wind. Families who remained until the very end recalled a surreal transformation. Temples, still towering palaces, still intact markets, still standing, but with the life drained out of them. Cities did not crumble immediately. They emptied first. Stone persisted, but purpose evaporated. And in those empty spaces, the collapse found its full momentum. The great turning away. The final stage of this slow catastrophe was not marked by ruin, but by decision. People left. Not in panic, not in a single exodus, but through a steady, determined choosing of new futures. The world that had shaped their ancestors was no longer able to support them, so they turned away from the old centers and toward emerging frontiers. Some moved to the northern lowlands where resources remained stable. Others followed coastlines that offered fisheries, saltworks, and trade. Still others traveled into the highlands where rainfall patterns were more forgiving. These migrations represented not defeat, but resilience, a recognition that survival required releasing the past. And as people left the cities they once sustained, ceased to function. Administrations dissolved, markets vanished, temples lost congregations, plazas fell silent. The jungle did not destroy the Maya world. The Maya themselves withdrew from a landscape that could no longer sustain them. The Great Collapse was not a single event, but a collective turning, a long, quiet reorientation of life. Yet even now we are only approaching the heart of the mystery. Before the jungle conquered the stones, one final chapter remained: the transformation of identity itself. The green tide at the edges. When people drifted away from the ceremonial centers, the forest moved immediately to reclaim its domain. It did not advance with violence or intent. It simply grew softly, persistently, in accordance with rhythms older than any kingdom. Vines crept across abandoned doorways. Saplings rooted in the cracks of causeways. Moisture gathered in the shadows of empty rooms, inviting the first layers of moss and ferns. Roots pushed up beneath plaster floors that had once been smoothed for royal processions. The great plazas, designed to hold thousands, slowly filled with drifting seeds and fallen leaves. In the silence, the first animals returned, deer testing the thresholds of old market squares, birds nesting atop once sacred altars, jaguars stalking through gardens long untended. To those who remained in the shrinking cities, this return was unsettling. It was as if the forest had been waiting, biding its time for centuries, watching the rise of stone from a respectful distance, knowing that all things eventually yield. The boundaries between the human world and the natural world dissolved. Roads blurred into winding paths, fields reverted to jungle clearings, the canopy thickened, softening outlines of pyramids that had once commanded the horizon. But nature's quiet reclamation was only one side of the transformation. Beneath it, the meaning of Maya identity itself was beginning to shift. The people who carried the world in memory. As families abandoned the towering cities, they did not leave empty-handed. They carried what they could: tools, maize, seeds, woven cloth. But more importantly, they carried memory. The memory of ancestors carved into stele. The memory of ceremonies performed beneath moonlit stairways. The memory of lineage language, the reckoning of time. This memory became portable. Communities that settled along coasts or in the highlands rebuilt their homes with simpler materials: timber instead of stone, thatch instead of limestone vaults. They adopted new agricultural strategies, planting crops according to the patterns of their new environments. They formed fresh alliances, shaping new local identities. But the deep cultural core endured. The Maya world did not die, it diffused. In modest homes far from the old capitals, families repeated stories of gods who carved the stars. In smaller plazas, local days of ritual continued even if the grand ceremonies had ended. In markets, language flowed as it always had, carrying the cadence of centuries. The collapse was not disappearance. It was decentralization, a great dispersal of life and knowledge across new landscapes. Yet the memory of the old cities lingered like a distant echo. The kings who faded into legends. In the newly scattered communities, the role of the king changed irrevocably. Once divine intermediaries, rulers had lost the foundations that gave their authority meaning. Without large populations, towering temples, or surplus food to support royal courts, the institution of kingship dissolved naturally. Some kings fled with their people, adopting roles closer to community elders. Others were abandoned as their subjects sought more sustainable lives elsewhere. A few attempted to hold on to fragments of power, but without the vast apparatus of the old cities, their voices grew faint. Over time, the kings of the classic period became memories figures in lineage, stories, names recited in ritual chants, symbols carved into heirloom objects. But the divine authority they once commanded no longer existed in the world. The political landscape flattened. Leadership became local, practical, rooted in survival rather than ceremony. This transition, seemingly a loss, also freed communities from the heavy obligations that had once strained them. Still, the old world lingered in spirit. And in its lingering, something new began. The night fires on distant hills. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation often brought people into new regions. As migrants settled farther from their ancestral capitals, they sometimes encountered communities that had long lived in those landscapes. These meetings were not always peaceful. Some groups guarded their lands fiercely, seeing newcomers as threats. Others welcomed them cautiously, forging alliances that blended traditions. Fires burned on hillsides at night, signals, warnings, celebrations, or calls for protection. Messages carried across ridges through smoke and torchlight. The meanings of these fires varied, but they signaled a world in transition. As the old states dissolved, dozens of smaller polities formed, merged, or vanished. Trade shifted from long-distance caravans to local exchanges. Ceremonial centers shrank into modest shrines tended by a handful of families. Yet even amid fragmentation, cultural knowledge survived. The cycle of days persisted, the language endured, the stories remained. From the ashes of collapse, new networks slowly took shape, informal, resilient, intertwined. These fires marked not only the end of an age, but the beginning of another. The pyramids that became mountain. In the decades following abandonment, the Great Pyramids transformed. No longer whitewashed with lime, they darkened under layers of soil and fallen leaves. Trees rooted themselves in terraces. Birdsong replaced ritual drums. From afar, these structures began to resemble natural hills, part of the landscape rather than the centerpiece of it. Travelers passing through the region sometimes glimpsed stone beneath creeper vines. Others found staircases cracked open by roots thicker than a man's arm, but most merely felt the presence of something ancient, hidden within the jungle. To those who had fled the cities, returning to these places brought mixed emotions: grief for what was lost, fear of what had driven them away, and awe at how quickly nature had absorbed their past. The pyramids stood, but their purpose had shifted. Where once they embodied divine power, they now served as silent markers of a world that had receded, a reminder that civilizations, no matter how grand, exist within larger cycles. The forest did not erase meaning, it softened it. It buried grandeur not out of malice, but out of continuity. Yet deep within the foliage, something important remained intact. The calendars that never stopped. Even as the great hieroglyphic centers fell quiet, the calendars that had structured Maya life for centuries continued to guide daily existence. No longer carved into towering stelae, they were kept in the minds of farmers and elders. The 260-day ritual cycle persisted. The 365-day solar year remained the framework for planting and harvest. Ceremonial days were observed in modest gatherings rather than monumental plazas. This continuity revealed something essential: the collapse had been political and urban, not cultural or civilizational. The people still understood their place in the cycles of earth and sky. They still named days with ancient combinations. They still told stories that connected them to the cosmos. The classic institutions had fallen, but the world that shaped them lived on, not in stone, but in memory, language, and tradition. And as the jungle swallowed the old centers, these intangible threads ensured that Maya identity never disappeared. Instead, it transformed. The whisper before renewal. By the time the last major cities were abandoned, the forest had covered much of their grandeur. Yet the collapse did not end in silence. It ended with movement, people shifting across the landscape, building new communities, innovating, adapting, and carrying forward the deep-rooted knowledge of their ancestors. From this dispersal would emerge a different Maya world, one centered not on giant capitals, but on smaller towns, not on divine kings, but on councils and lineage leaders, not on monumental architecture, but on resilient traditions carried from generation to generation. The collapse was not disappearance, it was transformation, a turning of the wheel, a new chapter in a civilization that would endure long after its stone cities faded under the canopy. But before renewal could take shape, one more stage awaited the long centuries during which the forest and the ruins would share a quiet companionship, holding the secrets of a fallen age. And in that stillness, the remnants of the past waited for rediscovery. The long quiet. For generations after the Great Dispersal, the abandoned cities of the South lay in a hush deeper than any ritual stillness that had once filled their plazas. It was not emptiness, but a different kind of presence, the presence of time settling like dust upon stone. Bird calls echoed through corridors where priests had once whispered incantations. Wind moved freely through chambers that had sheltered royal courts. Moonlight spilled across staircases where rulers had climbed to speak with the gods. The silence was not neglect, it was waiting. Roots gripped old walls like hands remembering their shape. The jungle did not destroy, it embraced. It wove itself around the stones, turning temples into living monuments, guardians of a world now inward and still. For the people who lived beyond the forest's edge, the ruins were not forgotten. They were spoken of gently, places of ancestors, places of power, places best visited with care, offerings, and humility. The collapse had emptied the cities. But the cities themselves had begun a new life, one defined not by human ambition, but by the slow dreaming of the earth. And in those dreams, the past endured, the roads that faded into stories. The Sakbiob, once gleaming white highways that bound kingdoms together, gradually disappeared beneath the thickening canopy. What remained were faint ridges beneath the soil threads of stone that connected forgotten courtyards to distant horizons. Travelers occasionally stumbled upon these lines. To the untrained eye, they were little more than raised ground, but to those who knew the signs, they were remnants of a world vast and connected. In village gatherings, elders told stories of ancestors who had walked these shining roads to great temples, carrying incense and offerings. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining highways as pale as moonlight, stretching endlessly across the land. With each retelling, the roads became less physical, and more mythic pathways, not merely of travel but of memory. Some communities followed the old lines during seasonal migrations, sensing the ghosts of alignment beneath their feet. Others avoided them, believing that powerful spirits still guarded the abandoned routes. The Sakbiob faded as infrastructure, but they flourished as story. And stories have a way of outlasting stone. The temples that became the bones of the earth. Deep in the forest, the pyramids stood like the vertebrae of some sleeping titan, massive, immovable, half swallowed by roots and soil. Over centuries, they became part of the landscape so fully that only the keenest observers could distinguish where nature ended and architecture began. Rain carved channels down their sides, trees wrapped their roots around steps and doorways, animals made dens in chambers where sacred fires once burned. Yet even transformed the temples kept their shape, a geometry too intentional to be mistaken for hills. Travelers who encountered these structures often felt a strange familiarity, as though the stones pulsed faintly with the memory of ancient ceremonies. Some approached with reverence, leaving small gifts of maize or flowers. Others kept their distance, sensing that the silence was not empty, but watchful. In time, the pyramids no longer belonged to kings or priests. They belonged to the forest, to the rain, to the slow breathing of the world. They had become relics of a cosmic order that still hovered behind the veil of the everyday reminders that humanity once shaped the landscape with purpose, and that harmony with the earth could be both created and lost. and in their endurance they held the shape of both achievement and caution, the art that survived in shadows. While stone monuments decayed slowly, the finer expressions of Maya artistry, painted murals, plaster reliefs, carved wooden lintels, faced a harsher fate. Moisture dissolved pigments, termites devoured wood, earthquakes cracked plaster scenes into fragments scattered across chamber floors, but not all was lost. In remote shrines preserved by overhanging cliffs, murals remained intact enough for later generations to see glimpses of ancient ceremonies. In deep, sealed-off rooms beneath collapsed temples, carvings survived untouched, as sharp as the day craftsmen finished them. Buried beneath centuries of soil, ceramic vessels waited patiently to be uncovered, their designs whispering stories of gods, myths, and rulers long gone. Artistic memory survived not because it defied nature, but because nature itself protected it. Shadows became archives, darkness became preservation, silence became a shield against time. When future eyes would eventually gaze upon these hidden works, they would be encountering not just objects, but echoes, fragments of a worldview preserved by accident and by the Earth's own slow guardianship. And in those echoes, the Maya voice remained alive, the seeds of a new Maya world. While the jungles grew over the old capitals, life continued elsewhere, vibrant, evolving, adaptive. Communities on the Yucatan Peninsula developed new political systems, shaped by councils rather than divine kings. Coastal settlements expanded trade networks with Caribbean and Gulf communities weaving new economic patterns. Highland towns blended ancestral traditions with innovations suited to their cooler climates and volcanic soils. Agricultural strategies changed as well. Where once large-scale maize farming dominated, smaller, more diverse plots took hold, resilient mixes of crops that weathered inconsistent rainfall. Ritual practice shifted from monumental plazas to village shrines. Timekeeping endured, but its interpretation adapted to new realities. Craft traditions continued, though, directed toward local needs rather than imperial display. This was not a shattered civilization. It was a decentralizing one, dispersing knowledge across many hands rather than concentrating it in royal courts. The Maya endured because they transformed, not through defiance of collapse, but through acceptance of change. And through that change, a new world began to take shape, one that would carry the memory of the old cities without being bound by their fall. The forest's long embrace. Over the next centuries, the relationship between humans and the jungle settled into a rhythm more balanced than before. People built smaller communities, less taxing on the landscape. Fields were rotated with care, allowing soil to renew. Hunting patterns shifted to avoid disrupting the forest's equilibrium. Trade ran along narrower lines, less extractive, more sustainable. The great cities became sacred in absence, places visited, rarely spoken of, often woven into myth as reminders of a past both admired and mourned. In their abandonment, they became part of the forest's story rather than the forest being part of theirs. Roots braided themselves through chambers once filled with incense. Bird nests lined the tops of royal staircases. The jungle canopy shielded carvings from the sun, preserving them as natural vaults. The earth and the ruins entered into a quiet partnership, each shaping the other. And in that shared silence, a profound truth: settled collapse was not annihilation, but transformation. The world that had risen so spectacularly had folded itself back into the land, leaving space for new forms of life, new communities, new stories. But the ruins were not finished. They were waiting. Waiting for the day the outside world would stumble upon them again. Waiting for rediscovery. Waiting for memory to be reawakened. The first wanderers' centuries, after the Great Dispersal, when the memory of the old capitals had faded into legend, the forest began to receive new footsteps, quiet, cautious, uncertain. Hunters moving through unfamiliar territory stumbled upon strange contours underfoot. Travelers paused at the sight of a symmetrical hill whose slope felt too precise to be natural. Villagers gathering timber reached the edge of embankments, that seemed strangely straight beneath the vines. These wanderers did not fully grasp what they had found, but they sensed presence of vastness slumbering beneath the undergrowth. Some left offerings of maize or flowers acknowledging the spirits believed to dwell in such places. Others turned away quickly, unsettled by the echoing silence around half-buried courtyards. A few returned home with stories of stone giants hidden in the forest, stories others half believed, half feared. No one sought to reclaim the ruins. They approached them as one might approach the edge of a sacred dreaming world, with respect, distance, and awe. And the ruins kept their counsel, watching the wanderers as quietly as they had watched the forest grow. The paths rediscovered. As generations passed, trails through the forest shifted, merging, disappearing, reappearing in new lines, shaped by trade and necessity. Some of these routes, by coincidence or by the memory of old geography, led directly to ancient sites. A merchant seeking salt might follow a ridge that once formed part of a sack bay. A woodcutter, tracing a dry stream bed, might find himself standing in the shadow of a pyramid, overgrown with towering cedar trees. A pilgrim visiting a remote shrine might notice fragments of carved stone beneath the roots of an immense strangler fig. These encounters accumulated slowly across centuries. Ruins became part of the mental landscape again, not as living cities, but as markers of ancestral grandeur. In some communities, whispered stories grew into formal tales of temples taller than any mountain of kings who spoke to the sky, of calendars older than the oldest trees. The ruins were no longer forgotten. They were remembered imperfectly, mythically, with reverence. Yet none of this was rediscovery in the modern sense. It was remembrance, the faint thread of memory surviving through generations, tying the living to the buried world. But a new wave of seekers would soon change the relationship entirely. The scribes of distant kingdoms. Long after the classic Maya world had dissolved, new powers rose on the horizon. In central Mexico, scribes and merchants traveling through distant territories heard rumors of immense stone structures lost beneath the trees. Some dismissed these stories, others recorded them faithfully, sending word back to their rulers. The idea of ancient cities swallowed by the jungle stirred the imaginations of those who received such messages. If these ruins existed, what treasures might they hold? What stories could they reveal? What forgotten peoples had built them? But the forest guarded its secrets well. Without local guides, outsiders rarely penetrated deep enough to see more than scattered stones. The ruins remained half myth, half memory. Still, curiosity had awakened far from the lowlands. A question had taken root. What ancient civilization had once ruled the forests of the south? The world beyond the Maya lands was beginning to feel the pull of the forgotten past, a call that would echo louder with time. The return of foreign eyes. Centuries later, the arrival of Europeans on the continent changed the trajectory of the entire region. New diseases swept through indigenous populations before many outsiders ever set foot inland, reshaping communities and weakening some of the smaller towns that had survived the collapse. But not all change was immediate destruction. Some explorers, soldiers and friars heard tales from Maya people about the great stone cities hidden in the jungle. At first, Europeans reacted with skepticism. How could a forest-dwelling people, they wondered, have built monuments rivaling those of ancient empires? Yet some were intrigued. They followed guides through dense green corridors, hacking paths with machetes, sinking into wetlands, climbing limestone ridges. When they reached the first major ruins, their accounts were filled with disbelief. Pyramids half as large as mountains, temples with carved faces staring out from under vines, stelae rising from the earth like the remnants of a lost world. Still, these early encounters did not lead to thorough study. The ruins were too vast, the forest too impenetrable, the political landscape too unstable. And the Maya, who guided these expeditions, held their own stories. Stories of ancestors, cycles and sacred places. Stories seldom fully shared with outsiders. Real discovery would take time, but the world had noticed, the scholars who followed the trails. In the centuries that followed, explorers and scholars increasingly traveled into Maya lands with a singular purpose: to understand the mysterious stone cities that defied European expectations. Some arrived with curiosity, others with ambition, a few with humility and willingness to learn from local communities. What they found astonished them. Temples taller than imagined, palaces stretching across terraces, ball courts carved with scenes of mythic battles, hieroglyphs etched in precise lines across stone, each symbol carrying stories unknown to the outside world. These scholars recorded what they saw: drawings, maps, measurements, rubbings of inscriptions. Their notebooks filled with sketches of soaring structures entangled in roots and vines. But even as they documented the ruins, they misunderstood much. They speculated wildly about lost races, vanished peoples, unknown artisans, rarely acknowledging the descendants who lived just beyond the forest's border, speaking the same languages, carrying the same cultural rhythms. Knowledge gathered, but understanding lagged. The ruins were being rediscovered physically. Culturally, they had never been forgotten. This gap between outside interpretation and local memory formed the beginning of a long journey toward a fuller truth. The Earth giving up its secrets. As more expeditions ventured into the jungle, layers of soil and plant life were peeled back, revealing carved stairways, collapsed chambers, and inscriptions long hidden from the sun. Each unveiling felt like the Earth exhaling, releasing stories it had guarded for centuries. Archaeologists uncovered murals preserved by chance. Artifacts lay where they had been left the day the cities were abandoned. Tools and ceramics hinted at daily life. Altars revealed clues of long-lost ceremonies. But the most profound revelations came from the hieroglyphs. Slowly, painstakingly, scholars began to decipher the script. Names of kings emerged, dates crystallized into sequences. Events once only guessed had found grounding in carved testimony. The ruins did not merely reveal themselves, they spoke. And through their voices, the classic Maya world began to rise from the forest, not in grandeur, but in understanding. What the forest had preserved. By the time the first inscriptions were translated, a new picture began to form, not of a mysteriously vanished civilization, not of a sudden and inexplicable disappearance, but of a society that had endured, transformed, and survived. The forest had preserved the stones, but the people had preserved the culture. Maya communities across the region continued to speak their ancestral languages, practice ancient cycles, tend crops with inherited techniques, and maintain traditions rooted in the same world that had once built the Great Pyramids. The collapse had never been total. It had been selective, political, urban, monumental, but not cultural. Rediscovery did not resurrect a lost people. It reunited the world with a civilization that had never truly vanished. But understanding this required listening, not just to stone, but to living voices. And the greatest revelations were still to come. The stones that finally spoke. Clearly, as scholars refined their interpretations of Maya glyphs, the narrative carved into stone began to unfold with astonishing clarity. Dates aligned across cities hundreds of kilometers apart. Royal lineages stretched backward through centuries. Battles once known only through faint rumor emerged as detailed historical events. Periods of prosperity and decline revealed themselves in sequences of triumphs, alliances, defeats, and dynastic shifts. And woven through all of it was a truth the forest had preserved. The collapse was not mystery, but consequence. Not sudden, but gradual. Not catastrophic, but cumulative. Not disappearance, but transformation. The inscriptions did not describe a vanishing civilization. They described a world under stress, political rivalry, environmental strain, social upheaval, echoing the patterns that archaeologists had slowly pieced together. The stones, patient through centuries of silence, had finally found readers who could hear their voice. And in that voice, the ancient Maya world regained its contours, the soil that remembered every season. Yet stone was only part of the story. scientists began to read a second archive, one not carved by human hands, but by nature itself. Sediment cores extracted from lake bottoms revealed layers of pollen ash and minerals deposited year after year. These layers became timelines of droughts and floods, of forest clearance and regrowth, of erosion accelerating and slowing. In some lakes, a sudden drop in aquatic organisms matched periods of intense drought. In others, bursts of soil deposition aligned with the expansion of agriculture. Later layers showed forest resurgence during the time cities emptied. The Earth had kept a meticulous diary, and in its pages the environmental pressures became visible. The collapse was not caused by one drought, nor by one war, nor by one ecological crisis. It was the convergence of many, a long tightening of conditions from multiple directions. The soil spoke quietly but with precision, and its testimony matched what the stones had whispered, the climate that shifted the fate of cities. As climate science advanced, researchers traced the patterns of ancient droughts to cycles in the wider world. Shifts in ocean temperatures and atmospheric currents reshaped rainfall across the tropics centuries before the collapse. The Maya had endured droughts before, but the droughts of the late Classic were longer, harsher, and more persistent than any in generations past. A drought alone does not collapse a civilization, but drought layered upon political rivalry, overexploited land-thinning soils, and the demands of monumental construction, that combination could bend the strongest networks to breaking. Climate was the pressure, politics was the fault line, population density was the load, war was the spark, resource exhaustion was the undertow. Together they formed a web no single kingdom could escape. The collapse was not fate. It was a cascading sequence of decision stresses and transformations shaped by forces both human and natural. And the climate cycles that influenced the ancient world were part of a larger pattern that continues even now, the people who never left. As archaeologists deepened their understanding, one conclusion grew impossible to ignore: the Maya did not disappear. Their culture lived on in languages spoken daily by millions, in weaving traditions passed down through families, in religious ceremonies that blended old and new, in agricultural practices refined over millennia. In markets across the Yucatan Highland, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, Maya communities continued to trade, using patterns inherited directly from their ancestors. Farmers still planted maize according to cycles known since antiquity. Elders still recited histories tracing their lineage to ancient towns. Ritual specialists still honored the cycles of earth and sky. The collapse had ended the age of massive stone cities, not the civilization itself. What European explorers encountered centuries later were not remnants of a lost people. They were descendants of the very builders of those cities, living links to the classic world. Understanding the collapse required listening to these communities whose traditions had carried the flame through centuries of change. The past was not buried in the ruins. It was alive in the voices of the living, the cities that were never silent. With every new excavation, every deciphered glyph, every conversation with Maya elders, a new truth emerged. The great cities had not been abandoned and forgotten in an instant. They had faded gradually like embers glowing beneath ash. Some cities continued ceremonial activities long after political control deteriorated. Others maintained pockets of population for generations beyond their supposed disappearance. A few served as pilgrimage sites for nearly a century after their decline. Abandonment was not a single event. It was a long, uneven retreat shaped by local circumstances, choices, and adaptations. The forest had claimed them physically, but culturally they remained present. Even as vines wrapped around staircases, stories traveled silently through the people who passed near the ruins, through families who remembered ancestors buried beneath the old plazas, through rituals still performed in the shadow of collapsed sanctuaries. The ruins were never silent. They simply changed their audience. The new understanding. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, an extraordinary synthesis emerged. The classic Maya collapse was not a riddle. It was a lesson, a reminder that civilizations can be magnificent and vulnerable at the same time. That complexity is strength until it becomes burden. That nature is partner until it becomes limit. That societies fall not when one pillar breaks, but when many do quietly, gradually, cumulatively. The collapse was political fragmentation intensifying warfare, environmental strain, population pressure, unpredictable drought, weakened legitimacy, shifting trade routes, social migration, and finally, a collective turning toward new ways of living. Together they formed the arc of decline. Yet the story does not end with destruction. It ends with continuity, the persistence of a people whose identity proved stronger than their monuments. The ruins stand not as tombstones, but as reminders that the Maya world endured, not because it resisted change, but because it transformed. And in that transformation lies the final truth of the collapse, the doorway to the last chapter. By the time modern science, archaeology, and Maya knowledge converged, a full picture had finally taken shape, one that united the voices of stone, soil, sky, and living tradition. Yet one part of the journey remained. Not the collapse itself, but the meaning of collapse. Not the ruins, but what they teach us. Not the silence of ancient cities, but the echoes they leave in our time. To understand the Maya collapse fully, the final step is reflection, to stand before the ruins and ask not only what happened to them, but what they reveal about us. That final meditation awaits. The weight of ruins under sunlight. To stand among the ancient cities today is to witness two worlds at once, the world that was and the world that remains. Stone chambers sit half open to the sky, their corners softened by centuries of rainfall. Pyramids rise through the treetops, their outlines blurred by the slow insistence of creeping vines. Monuments lean gently, as if listening to the forest that has settled around them like a vast green ocean. In the heat of midday, the ruins feel timeless. In the cool hush of dawn, they feel alive. Every stone carries the memory of hands that shaped it, voices that echoed across plazas, footsteps that packed earth into smooth walkways. And in these stones lies the final layer of the Maya collapse, the meaning that emerges only when the noise of history quiets and the lessons become visible in the stillness. The mirror of human ambition. The rise of the classic Maya was an act of extraordinary creativity, architecture, aligned to celestial cycles, mathematics woven into daily life, political systems shaped by cosmic ideology. But the same forces that enabled such beauty carried seeds of fragility. Cities grew large because leaders demanded grandeur. Monuments soared because rulers sought immortality. Networks expanded because competition drove innovation. Ambition shaped the skyline and over time strained the world that fed it. The collapse reveals a familiar truth: human brilliance can outpace the resources that sustain it. When ambition grows faster than resilience, societies stretch themselves thin. Not through failure of imagination, but through excess of it. The Maya achieved heights that astonish even now. And in their achievements lies both wonder and warning. The limits of the earth. The forest remembers everything: the centuries of clearing the fields carved along ridgelines, the slow return of trees after abandonment. Environmental records show the pressure of population on fragile soil, the consequences of deforestation and the long shadow cast by drought. But these scars are not accusations. They are evidence of a world shaped by choices and climate intention and necessity. What the Maya endured reflects a challenge shared across time: the need to balance ambition with stewardship, growth with sustainability, prosperity with limits. The earth is generous, but not infinite. The Maya collapse embodies this truth with quiet elegance, not as catastrophe, but as transition into a different relationship with the land. And that transition holds a lesson for every age: the resilience in transformation. The most important revelation of the collapse is not decline, but survival. When the great cities faltered, the Maya did not vanish. They moved, adapted, shifted, rebuilt. They carried their knowledge into new landscapes, weaving ancient tradition into new forms. Agriculture continued, ritual continued, language continued. The civilization did not end. It changed shape. The fall of the classic cities was not the demise of a people, but the evolution of a world, a dispersal that preserved what mattered most. This resilience stands as a profound reminder. Strength lies not only in growth, but in flexibility, not only in building, but in adapting, not only in enduring, but in transforming. Civilizations survive not by resisting change, but by moving with it. The echo that reaches us. When modern travelers walk through these ruins, they feel something difficult to describe, a presence, a weight, an echo. It is the whisper of lives lived with purpose, astronomers charting the heavens, farmers tending maize under shifting rains, rulers interpreting sacred cycles, families weaving stories into every object they crafted. It is the reminder that thousands of years of history can be condensed into a single moment of silence, the moment when a traveler stands before a carved stela and touches a symbol inscribed by hands long gone. These echoes connect us to the ancient world not through spectacle, but through continuity, the rhythms of seasons, the fragility of societies, the search for meaning beneath the turning of the sky. The Maya collapse speaks across time because it mirrors cycles that shape all civilizations. And in its voice we find our own reflection, the sky that still watches. The Maya understood the heavens with extraordinary precision. Their calendars traced eclipses, solstices, and planetary cycles with astonishing accuracy. Their temples aligned with celestial events that marked the boundaries of the year. Those same stars shine over the ruins today. Constellations seen by priests atop pyramids still arc across the night. The Milky Way still stretches overhead like a celestial river once believed to be the path of souls. Venus still glows in the dawn as it did when its cycles shaped royal decisions. The continuity of the sky reminds us that the collapse of cities does not diminish the enduring rhythms of the world. Civilizations rise and fall, but the cosmos remains. And in that constancy, the Maya found meaning that still resonates. The stars that guided their calendars now guide ours. The heavens that shaped their worldview still turn above us. The final lesson. In the end, the collapse of the classic Maya tells a story not of disappearance, but of balance between human ambition and planetary limits, between cultural endurance and political decline, between permanence and impermanence, between stone that stands and life that moves. The ruins are not monuments to failure. They are monuments to the complexity of existence, to the brilliance of a people who shaped the world with mathematics, astronomy, and imagination, and who adapted when their first world could no longer sustain them. The classic cities fell, the Maya civilization lived on, and still lives. What remains in the forest is not a mystery, but a reminder that strength is not measured by what remains standing, but by what continues to grow after the stones fall silent. The closing, quiet. As the last light fades across the temples, the chorus of the forest rises, insects humming in the underbrush, birds settling into canopy nests, winds brushing across leaves that have claimed forgotten roots. This sound, this gentle, endless breath of the earth is the final chapter of the ancient cities. The Maya built a world of astonishing complexity. The forest reclaimed it with patient grace, and together they left behind a landscape where time folds softly over memory. Stand here long enough and you can almost feel the heartbeat of both worlds, stone and soil, past and present, collapse and renewal, mingling into a single, quiet truth. The story ends here in the stillness beneath the canopy, where the ancient cities dream and the living world continues its long, unbroken song.